Alrighty, welcome to the talk. Identity attacks have changed. Have your IR playbooks. And so, quick introduction to myself. My name is Josh Gideon. Started my career in consulting, conducting things like penetration tests, red teaming, and then later transitioned into a kind of more blue team centered focus role. From there, I was conducting engagements with clients on things like attack simulations, purple teams, SOC improvement programs, and IR simulations. So following on from that, I joined a large financial as the head of GSOC and later transitioned into the director of SecOps. And there I led a team, spanning things like SOC, IR, threat intel, engineers, DLP, really managing a kind of whole range of threats, whether that be run-of-the-mill script kiddies all the way through to fairly sophisticated adversaries. I then decided to join Push roughly about 5 months ago as a senior product manager, really largely so I could contribute to this identity space, as we all recognize now that it's a problem area for most organizations, and certainly going to be a continuing challenge into the foreseeable future. So what am I going to cover off on this on this webinar? So essentially we're going to cover off the evolution of identity attacks from an incident response perspective. So we'll look at things like how identity incident investigations used to look like and how they've evolved into what we're seeing today. Next, we'll look at the challenges introduced by SaaS and cloud services and what we need to consider as incident responders. And lastly, we'll look at kind of how Push can help augment IR investigations. I've also got a couple of demos, real life demos to cover off at the end. Alrighty. So if you've been working in the industry for the last 10, 20 years, you'll probably be fairly familiar with this slide. So my days in this industry really started around the mid-2010s, but by that point, a lot of these techniques that you see here were pretty well established. Attackers in the past would focus primarily on the perimeter. Organizations, introduce a series of controls as a result of that. Things like, good patching, vulnerability management, segmenting the DMZ, improve code quality, these types of things. And then, of course, subsequently attackers then started shifting their attention more towards the endpoint and also credentials. And so delivering malware as a means of gaining access to the endpoint really became a big theme, although credential phishing was and really continues to be, as prevalent. And so taking the malware route, if I think of that time, particularly during the 2010s, really one word springs to mind, and that's macros. Macros are pretty rampant, and the ultimate goal here was to try and get a user to enable macros on a malicious document, and that would essentially execute malware on the endpoint. And again, from an attack perspective, the ultimate goal here was to gain command and control to that endpoint. But also taking the phishing route, again, similar. In a similar vein, the ultimate goal here was to gain access to credentials that an attacker could use, then to more than likely gain access to some kind of remote access portal, whether that be some kind of VPN, maybe Citrix portal. And again, the ultimate goal here is to gain access to the network, or specifically gain access to a host, and then use that to pivot towards a specific objective. Once an attacker managed to gain access to an endpoint or a host, through things like internal reconnaissance, lateral movement, the ultimate goal then was to achieve whatever objective that may be. But of course, the primary focus there was AD, and specifically attacking identity as a way to, AD identities as a way to gain privileged access to the network and then go on to achieve whatever objective. And so how did detection response work? The majority of the detection sources, kind of during this time and really also today, came from like suspicious endpoint behavior, suspicious logins, phishing emails being reported by users, and really kind of other internal network activity. Most of the analysis was conducted on the endpoint, via EDRs, but augmented with other logging information such as login events, network activity. And again, we were able to do a lot of this analysis because we owned the infrastructure. The hosts were ours, and so too was the network. But in the new world, this kind of paradigm has fundamentally shifted, in the new world. SaaS is shifting the balance of network architecture away from your control, and instead of the network being your perimeter, the balance is now switched to identity being the new perimeter. Historically, employees would like I mentioned, you remotely VPN or access Citrix, to gain access to the network, or if you're in the office, just get connected to the network that way. But really, kind of as SaaS continues to trump the world of apps, all an employee needs is an internet connection, and sometimes direct connectivity to that application. And so, of course, we've tried to manage these risks, with the likes of SSO and Zero Trust, but we've seen time and time again of where these controls are failing. So just to take a look at the last couple of years, these are some of the high-profile incidents that we've seen, specifically where identity was the primary kind of attack vector. I'm not going to dwell on all of these incidents, but this slide really does kind of illustrate the impact. The Snowflake's attacks in 2024 were arguably, the biggest cybersecurity headlines of the year. I guess if you don't count CrowdStrike in there. And this has continued this year with identity breaches from the likes of like Scattered Spider and Shiny Hunters. The point here is that we're seeing an upward trend, of attacks against SaaS and cloud services, all through some form of identity compromise. And so what's changed, and how are adversaries now targeting identities? Well, firstly, the scale of the SaaS problem is growing and will inevitably continue to grow. Not only are your T0 apps, or SaaS now, think of like your IDPs, but also everything ranging from like your dev tools all the way through to your CRM systems, even down to things like, travel websites, booking systems. And so, effective identity and access management and network controls is really our primary answers for controlling access to these apps. But these are not always the silver bullets we expect them to be. And so, like I said, SSO comes with its own unique challenges. Most organizations will try and restrict and manage authentication to SaaS and cloud services using SSO. Enforcing SSO really enables an organization to apply strong authentication policies. Think like strong passwords, MFA, conditional access. But in an ideal world, an organization will enable SSO with like passkeys, because passkeys are phishing resistant. However, we all know that phishing passkeys are difficult to roll out. They're also difficult to manage, and so it's very common. It's very common for organizations who roll out passkeys to also support backup methods that are, I guess to some degree, kind of lesser secure. And so fish kits such as like Evil Jinx downgrade the auth method. So even if you've got passkeys enabled, the likes of, like, as I said, Evil Jinx can force the login to a less secure method. It's also very common for applications to allow for other login methods simultaneously. That leads to a very complex form of identity. For example, some apps may not support like SSO entirely, and may simultaneously support other local login methods. It's very common to see applications that are connected to SSO, but then continue to allow historical accounts where a username and password was configured. Lastly, in the final example, we can see it's quite a complex example, so I won't go into all the details. We've published a lot of materials specifically on this technique, and we're referring to a technique we've coined cross IDP impersonation, or really kind of what this is setting up an SSO with a different provider. And this is when an attacker manages to register an account with another IDP and then using that other provider to authenticate into an application. So for example, if you're using the likes of Microsoft Entra as a primary IDP, but an attacker is able to register an account using Google, then it's possible to circumvent those SSO controls or policies that you have on Entra and just go in via Google. So again, as a kind of incident responder, it's important to factor in the nuances involved in authentication. SSO, even with passkeys, is an incredibly effective control, but there are ways to reduce the effectiveness, if not, completely circumvent these types of authentications as a way of, compromising an account and gaining access to an application. There are also inherent complexities, particularly logging complexities involved in SaaS and cloud services that really can be abused by an attacker. And so we've already covered off the scenario where an attacker can target other authentication channels, whether that be through backup auth methods or other auth methods allowed by the application. So that's other way of gaining access to a target application. The other thing is worth considering, again, as a responder is, are there other tenants or versions of the applications that could be, that could also be targeted? So the 2024 Snowflake incident is a great example where different tenants can result in a compromise. So again, as an IR team, you may it's important to remember that even though you may have all of the controls enforcing your primary tenants. What about this other tenants that maybe less secure or even forgotten about? And then lastly, of course, there's all these other authentication channels you can think about. An app may be configured with for employees to authenticate via SSO with a specific provider. But then what if it allows other IDPs to authenticate to the application? The other addition to that is using things like if the application allows personal accounts or even external accounts. So there's this whole range of attack surface that attackers can leverage in order to compromise either an identity or a targeted application. And it's worth, again, as an incident responder, that we're aware and we understand that there is this kind of scale of or this wide attack surface. And so I just wanted, just before I jump in there, so as an IR team, it's really important that we recognize that there are a series of techniques across all stages of the kill chain. It's not just gaining access to the account, but there are things like persistence mechanisms that an attacker can use to maintain access to an application or to an identity beyond just compromising the initial account. There are ways you can laterally move and so on. And so there's this plethora of attack techniques that are applicable to just SaaS that we need to be aware of. And if you're interested in this particular matrix, check out the link. It's our SaaS attacks matrix, and again, it kind of details all the different techniques that we're currently aware of across all stages of the kill chain, specifically targeting SaaS. And so I just want to jump into a couple of demos just to highlight, again, that variety of techniques when it comes to targeting SaaS. So in this example, we can make an assumption here that an attacker has managed to gain access to an SSO account, specifically on Okta. I know this isn't like an administrator account or some kind of high level or high privileged sysadmin account. It's just a normal user account. And so on the accounts panel, we can see the specific apps that the user has access to, and specifically they have access to Shortcut. Now, if you're not familiar with Shortcut, it's a ticket managed application. Now on Shortcut, just like most other SaaS apps, it allows the user to generate API tokens. And so by generating an API token, an attacker can maintain access to Shortcut, even if the SSO account which they'd compromised, the SOC caught wind of it, they reset credentials, and therefore the attacker no longer has access. But with an API token, that gives them access to the REST API, and they can perform whatever action they want, and of course maintain access beyond just the SSO account. And of course, if this user account had access to 20, 30, 40, whatever, hundreds of apps, they could of course then generate API tokens on every single app. Now in this second example, we're showing Expensify, and here Expensify actually gives you the ability to add secondary login methods. So in this scenario, an attacker who's managed to gain access to the application could add a secondary login method using an attacker-controlled email. And again, it's really just as simple as adding an email, and then the attacker will maintain access to the application beyond even if the SSO account is remediated. The second example I want to show here is a little bit more advanced, a little bit more complicated. We've got a lot of resources published on this technique. And specifically we'll be looking at SAML jacking. So again, what we're going to assume here is, again, the Okta account is not anything high privilege, or the SSO account is not high privilege, not a sysadmin, but we can maybe assume that this is potentially like a finance user, and this finance user of course has access to Expensify. It's really common for an organization who has hundreds, maybe even thousands of different SaaS apps, where each app has a specific application owner, and of course there are administrators for those applications. And so it's a very plausible scenario to say that the likes of a head of finance user may have admin control over systems such as like Expensify. And so in this scenario, we found that an attacker has found an account who's an admin of Expensify, and then they can go in and configure the SAML configuration that is currently set up for Okta. So if you're not familiar with SAML, it's effectively, it means that essentially when you log into the app, it redirects to a different URL, and that really happens during the login process after you've seen the legit URL. And so from a user's perspective, the original login URL looks completely legit and will be prompted for credentials. And so if you can redirect somewhere malicious, it's a pretty convincing social engineering technique. So in this case, we're going to use SAML jacking as a very kind of sneaky lateral movement technique. So we'll go into the SAML configuration and we'll replace the URLs with our malicious Okta tenant. But this Okta tenant could be something like an attacker in the middle toolkit as well, which allows us to harvest credentials or even steal session tokens. And so if we then go back into Expensify, and of course Expensify then will require an email, we authenticate, that redirects, because we've set up SAML, that redirects to our malicious Okta tenant, and from here we can harvest credentials, again, or we can steal session tokens. So we could really use this technique like a watering hole attack as a means of like obtaining credentials to other accounts if we want to. So anybody that tries to authenticate to Expensify will be redirected to our malicious Okta tenant. We could use it to escalate privileges, of course, by naturally having access to other accounts. We can use it to laterally move or maintain persistent access. But ultimately, all these techniques emphasize the complexities of modern IR in the SaaS world, and there's really kind of a lot more to think about than just containing the SSO account. It's really important to think about the breadth of an overall SaaS attack. And so we've seen how attackers are using compromised accounts, but how identity attacks really come into life. And so really, irrespective of the objective, identity attacks tend to always start with phishing as the primary method. So we're now seeing kind of phishing being used to serve two primary purposes. First one is like specifically to compromise credentials or steal sessions via, whether that be kind of normal credential harvesting emails or whether that be through adversary in the middle toolkits. With adversary in the middle toolkits of things, reverse proxies, the likes of Evil Jinx that I've mentioned. The second is to deliver info stealing malware. And so info stealers really exploded last year with with Snowflake breaches that we mentioned earlier. Specifically when they're talking about Snowflake, 80% of the credentials used to log in had appeared in info stealer dumps. But ultimately, kind of both techniques lead to account takeover. But we're also seeing, phishing techniques and delivery methods change. We're seeing a rise in phishing via alternative sources, think things like, social media or malvertising. Likely, probably a reflection on adversaries recognizing the challenges and bypassing existing controls, such as email gateway systems. However, that said, even phishing techniques themselves are evolving and becoming a lot more sophisticated. So, attackers are now leveraging the likes of, bot protection, DOM obfuscation, one-time links and kind of other anti-analysis techniques as ways of circumventing existing controls in order to deliver a phishing email or phishing link even. And so look, I'm not going to delve into the details of phishing a lot. We've covered phishing quite a lot in other resources, so go check out the link in the bottom right or scan the QR code. There's even some great webinars to listen to. And so what's changed? What does that mean for IR? And so first things first, really the kind of as the shift towards, as the architectural shift has moved away from like kind of internal networks towards cloud, and identity being the primary vector, this has really kind of equally affected our ability to respond. So in the old world, an attacker would need to establish foothold in the network, establish C2, perform reconnaissance, escalate privileges, and so on and so on. But of course now, as we're in the identity world, driven world, where SaaS is kind of is our prime, where SaaS is very much used everywhere. The time to achieve an objective can be much, much shorter. And the ability to automate, of course, is much greater now. So consequently, as a response team, we're less reliant on being, reactive. We're more kind of reliant now on preventative controls. And of course, there's also this new wave of cloud-conscious attackers, born into the SaaS world, with a totally different mindset on attacking organizations. So again, as incident responders, it's kind of important that we recognize this shift. Granted, knowledge of traditional attack techniques is paramount, but also is having this awareness of this whole different suite of attacks that are specific to SaaS. And then, of course, the adversaries that are leveraging these types of techniques in order to perform their attacks. Visibility is, and of course, continues to be a continuing challenge. You no longer have the same level of visibility as you used to, largely because of gaps in SaaS logging, which really kind of makes answering all the questions that we need during incident response very difficult. So, for example, you may find apps that don't provide the audit logs at your specific product tier. You may not even be aware of the apps, of all apps, think kind of shadow SaaS. And if you're not collecting those centrally, of course, you're not going to have any visibility. And of course, if you're not connecting them centrally as well, you also have this availability and retention problem. Again, if an attack has happened in the past, of course, if you're not retaining those logs, how are you able to go off and investigate? You may even find that some apps don't provide the level of login you need to perform an investigation, and so in order to actually understand what's happening, there may not be enough information there for you to investigate. So ultimately, SaaS has logging limitations and really kind of makes it more difficult for incident responders to get the answers they need. And so what do we need to consider when we're building out IR playbooks for SaaS? So during IR, we're always faced with just enough information to lead on to the next part of an investigation. And so when dealing with identity-based compromises, we need to be able to answer at a minimum 3 core questions. What apps are our users using? How are they logging into and which MFA is being used? What other apps can be accessed from this account? So really kind of answering these very fundamental questions can help us determine what's the potential blast radius and where should we focus our investigation. And so how does push help in all this? Well, you can think of push as kind of like EDR but for your browser. We spoke a lot about identity attacks starting from phishing, and so really no matter the delivery mechanism, we mentioned attackers are switching the delivery mechanisms more towards away from kind of email or in conjunction with email towards things such as malvertising, things such as socials. But no matter which delivery mechanism, phishing pages will always end up in the browser. And really that's exactly where we are. We sit in the browser as an extension, and so we have kind of very unique visibility into what's happening within the browser. And we have phishing capabilities baked into the product itself that can detect and block in real time phishing pages as we see them. We've recently introduced a new feature that really helps incident response teams gain visibility and contextual awareness into what happened in the lead up to a detection, a phishing detection. Again, because we sit in the browser, we have a fairly unique view around what's going on within the browser itself. And so with timelines, again, you can build up this contextual understanding around what happened. So things like, did the user click a link? Did we see any type of redirections? Was there any form submitted? Did the user navigate to certain links? And again, you can, as an incident responder, you can build up this picture and help understand where did this phishing page come from? What is the root cause for this specific detection? We've also introduced screenshotting. Phishing, of course, tends to be very short-lived, whether attackers use things like one-time links, whether it just phishing getting reported fairly quickly and therefore taken down. And so as a result, it's if attackers are using one-time links and phishing gets taken down, it's very hard for an investigator to perform that analysis if they haven't seen, if they haven't caught the link in the right time. And so, of course, being in the browser, we have this, again, unique view, and we can see exactly what the user sees. And so screenshots we can see exactly the specific page that a user has visited that's triggered a detection, and that's presented to an incident response analyst. So again, because we're in the browser observing logins to all of your work applications in real time, we can also build up this unique perspective of the potential blast radius if an account is compromised. So in this particular example here, you can see that it was an SSO account with no MFA. As a result of that, there's potentially 3 apps that were compromised. Those apps are specifically the apps that are connected via SSO. And then you've got other 2 accounts that are at risk. And those are accounts where the user is sharing the same password for their SSO account as they are for other applications. And so again, as an incident responder, and I'm looking at that helps me very, very, very quickly understand what's the potential impact of this particular compromise. So just to cover off a couple of demos. First demo is a phishing attack against an SSO account. And so in this first demo, we've got an individual by the name of Anna who logs into LinkedIn, just going about their normal business, checks their messages, and sees a message from somebody called Brad. Now Brad has sent over a link, and so if Anna clicks on that link via LinkedIn, they get redirected to what seems like a normal Okta login page. This is actually my attacker in the middle toolkit, specifically Evil Jinx, that is reverse proxying the Okta IDP that Anna uses to authenticate to normally. And so Anna goes ahead and enters her credentials. And of course, because this is an attack in the middle toolkit, we can then go off and obtain the credentials that Anna used to authenticate. And so if we look into the platform then, first things first, what we see is a detection. And this is specifically the platform detecting that there was a phishing incident. And so on the left-hand side, you've got this timeline to build that kind of contextual awareness around what exactly happened in the lead up to this specific detection that we caught. And so you can see here that Anna was browsing LinkedIn until eventually, right at the bottom, we've got a phishing tool detected. And then at the bottom, again, we can see that Anna submitted a form, and this was Anna submitting her SSO credentials. And again, there are a series of detections marked in red that we've found here. If you scroll through the detections, we can see that there's a screenshot of the phishing page, and then eventually we can see that Anna used her SSO password on this site. So this is what we consider a critical detection, because Anna's gone ahead and entered her SSO credentials into a phishing site, and therefore, as an incident responder, we need to go off and investigate immediately. Those credentials are now compromised. So just to kind of illustrate what the blast radius here, we can see on the left-hand side that there was a password phished. We can see that there are 10 other apps that are potentially compromised as a result of this, and these are 10 apps that are connected to Anna's SSO account, and she can SSO into these applications. And then there are 2 accounts also at risk, and that's because Anna's reusing her same password on Okta as she is on these other passwords. And so if we click into these SSO accounts, again, we can get more enriched information into exactly the accounts that may have been compromised. And then also we can see things like the findings associated to those accounts. Now you can think of findings kind of like identity-based vulnerabilities. And so in this case, we can see that Anna is actually using Datadog, and she's authenticating into Datadog using a series of different methods. So we've got Google OIDC logins. We've even got SAML-based Okta logins, so maybe Datadog is set up for SSO, but we're also seeing things like password-based authentications into Datadog. And the interesting thing here is that we will also record things like if the MFA is registered on that account. And so again, because we're seeing the likes of a password-based authentication, we can see whether MFA is also enforced in that account. And in this case, we can see that MFA is not enforced. So again, as an incident responder, you may be worried, you may be thinking, okay, well look, even if we've got SSO set up, maybe there are other ways in which an attacker could gain access to the application. Of course, you'd want to go off and investigate the login activity, investigate whether there's been any actions on that account that weren't necessarily Anna. And so just to kind of highlight one thing, so what we saw there is the phishing attack not being blocked, and that was because our controls have been set up in monitor mode. This was largely just for demo purposes. But if I was to just show you what it would look like if we put these controls into block mode, specifically our phishing control. So here we've put our phishing control into block mode. We've added a message which will show to the employee if we detect a phishing page, and then and the employee is blocked from accessing it. Same scenario, Anna goes back to LinkedIn. She opens the same link, and we can see here that push automatically detects that this is a phishing site and blocks Anna from gaining access. One more example, I'll run through this one fairly quickly. So in this example, what we've got is a user trying to authenticate into Postman using a username and password. Once they authenticate, they're prompted immediately to reset their credential, reset their password. And in this particular case, it's because that password is actually a stolen credential that's been found on a criminal marketplace. And so again, because we can observe logins in real time, we can correlate stolen credentials, on criminal marketplaces against specific logins that we're seeing within the browser itself. And so Push has raised a detection to see stolen credentials. So really what I want to emphasize here is back in 2023, the Okta IR teams were dealing with a breach via one of their support staff. So the threat actor was able to gain access to an administrative account specifically on a customer support panel, I believe. And so when Okta investigated, they found that the support worker had actually authenticated into their browser using a personal account. And then of course, if you're with synchronization enabled, so if you're then typing in corporate credentials into your browser, saving those credentials to the in-browser manager, that in-browser password manager then gets synchronized to the personal account. And so what they concluded is that an adversary had managed to gain access to that personal account by some means, whether that be through the likes of info sealers on a personal device or maybe just weak credentials on that personal account, and had managed to gain access to credentials. And so if you're investigating the same thing, you're seeing stolen credentials and you have Push installed, what you could do is again maybe take some kind of hypothesis and say, are these credentials being synchronized to a personal account? And so again, because we're in the browser, we can see exactly what accounts are authenticated into that browser. And in this case, you can see that my user account has a personal Gmail address authenticated into the browser with synchronization enabled. And so it's very plausible to say that, my personal account could have been compromised, and as a result, those credentials were sold on a criminal marketplace, and then eventually, we were able to see those because we correlate the stolen credentials from a criminal marketplace against the logins that we see. Great stuff. Okay. And then in summary. So in summary, instant response has added complexities in the world of decentralized SaaS, with new techniques and attack paths and really less time to respond. SaaS has introduced, different mechanisms for persistence, lateral movement, exploitation, but really app level visibility is still limited. Identity data is really key to investigating and responding to SaaS breaches, but what you need to do is go beyond just the IDP and consider all login and access methods. And of course, the browser is really a great source for a telemetry source and a control point when responding to SaaS attacks. Again, which mostly happen in the browser. All right, thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Any questions?
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. Great. So we've had a few questions come in there. There's still time to ask questions. If you'd like to throw them out there, please do. But we'll start working through some of those now. So first question, what are the most common instant response triggers that you come across in SaaS? You mentioned phishing, but are there others?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. Of course, you've got the threat intel side of things where you've got things like, compromised credentials. And of course, in the platform where we are actually, we have a compromised credentials, a feed that comes in that we do correlation on, like I pointed out in the previous demo. And so, so threat intel certainly is one aspect to it. Of course, you've then got the the kind of risky sign-in side of things from your IDPs, whether that be, like Microsoft Defender, for example, gives lots of indicators, particularly around risky sign-ins. And then, yeah, I guess those are probably your two main sources. And of course, phishing is a big proponent of kind of initial, potential compromises as a result of potential credential phishing result compromises. So I would say that probably those are the top three. Of course, there are others. I guess they could come in from all different types of sources. But yeah, I would probably say those are the top three.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. What specific actions do you capture in your detections?
So I'm going to guess this is in relation to the timelining feature that we've recently introduced. So so essentially, kind of, it's actually, that feature is quite interesting and has been super useful to a lot of our customers already. And the reason, so essentially, what we're capturing there is things like: have you opened a new tab? Have you navigated to a certain link? Have we seen redirections? Have we seen a form being submitted? So that could be an indicator of, credentials being submitted, for example. We will capture where we think a password has been entered as well. And like I said, this kind of ties into our other controls. For example, the SSO, we have a control specifically around reusing or using your SSO password on a different app that's not your SSO. And so again, we use this telemetry in order for us to raise detections, again, like I said, around this SSO password being used. So, but again, because we have this telemetry, we were seeing even with customers already, we're able to build up this view of phishing links that are coming from all different sources. In fact, we saw one fairly recently just coming from WhatsApp, which is a fairly interesting use case, because again, there's a lot of controls around emails and so on, but then of course you've got these other avenues and where phishing is coming from. And so, but yeah, so yeah, just a long answer to say there's a series of events again that we're building up within that timeline. But again, I guess the whole premise of that is really just to try and get to deliver that on that message around EDR in the browser, to gain visibility into the browser that we just that we didn't have before.
Great, excellent. Okay, next question. Are there any ways you could use this data to drive remediations as well as response?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, we have a series of controls within the platform. I pointed them out in the demo, but we like to think of the platform as a kind of like one-click deploy platform where we have a series of controls, and those controls have things like blocking actions on them to prevent certain things from happening. To give you an example, phishing is a great example where we have a series of phishing detections in the platform, and the control allows you to block phishing in real time in the browser, right? So as soon as somebody clicks a link, we kind of analyze that page and we'll block it. And so I guess in terms of remediation here, there really isn't anything to remediate there. But again, maybe as a SOC team, you want to go off and do some analysis, find out where that link came from. Maybe you want to block things in the proxy. But again, because we're blocking things, we're blocking in real time. And so, but there are other controls. I've mentioned things like SSO password protection. One of our key controls is MFA enforcement. And so when you authenticate into an application, we can see whether you have MFA enforced on that app. And so again, we can guide the user through like our in-browser prompts to say, if we detect the fact that you don't have MFA, click this button, we'll redirect you to your MFA page, and then guide the user into essentially enforcing MFA. So I guess like a lot of the remediation in the traditional sense, when we think about incident response, where containing machines and so on, we're not. I guess we're more focused on specifically blocking actions and and kind of guiding the user into good practices, so to say.
I suppose that plays into just the nature of the attacks changing, and right, you need to be more proactive in hardening these things as opposed to if you're leaving it until post-compromise. Yeah, it's the bad thing has probably already happened by that point, right? So probably plays into the nature of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, to my point earlier, SaaS-based attacks are just to some degree, it's rapid, right? And it's much more difficult now for a response team to be reactive as opposed to, relying on kind of preventative controls to really kind of mitigate the attack. So Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what we've built into the platform is with that mindset of just, let's block the attack, as opposed to trying to be as reactive. And then, but then of course, if we are trying to be reactive, the data's there. We're collecting all this login information. We're collecting information on accounts. Where it's a phishing page, we have enough information for a responder to go off and investigate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. I think this might be the last one. Might have two more. But how do companies typically deploy the push extension? MDM, download?
Yeah, so there are multiple different ways you can deploy the extension. The most common way that we see, particularly for large enterprises, is really via some form of MDM solution, whether that be through the likes of Intune, whether that be for where the Mac OS states something like Jamf, or it could be group policy. Yeah, really kind of any way that you can essentially get the extension, rolled out to your state. And I must say, it is incredible. I would be biased in saying this, but it is incredibly easy to deploy. So it's we have within the platform the ability to kind of generate even the configuration you can use on your MDM platforms, and then again it's very much a kind of as simple as creating a policy and then rolling out the extension. I will say that there are other ways as well. So if you have maybe you don't have a managed estate and you wanted to roll this out using other means, you could manually install things. You can even email out a link which will essentially guide the user into installing the extension and then enrolling the extension. So like I said, it's super simple and it's all baked into the platform. If you wanted to give it a try.
Great. Okay, I think we've got one more and then we'll call it there. So finally, how then is this data exposed to customers? Like, is there an opportunity to create automated workflows, for example?
Yeah, exactly. So we are, I guess we're kind of a modern, I guess if you think about web app architecture, it's very modern web app architecture, very kind of API driven, and then any events that you see coming off the application are exposed via a webhook. And so if you wanted, to create custom automations or anything, you can consume those webhook events, and then, whether you consume it into your SIM or maybe a SOAR platform or some kind of automation platform, you could use that to then go off and create whatever type of automations you wanted to. And similarly, again, with things like the REST API, if you wanted to, ingest detections and then perform some form of correlation with additional sources, again, you can consume that information via their API. And so yeah, in a nutshell, everything is all exposed and easy to consume.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Well, yeah, I think we'll call it there. So, thanks very much, everybody, for attending. If you'd like to know more about Push, please go to our website, pushsecurity.com. And thanks very much, and we hope to see you next time. All right.
Good stuff. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.